Some moments change a man's heart forever. When little Sarah clutched her ear and cried out to her father, wealthy rancher Thomas McKenna felt something break inside his chest. In the 1800s frontier, this rich cowboy who had built his empire on grit and gunpowder suddenly found himself racing through darkness toward the town doctor, his daughter's pain tearing through him. This hardened man, who had faced down rustlers without flinching, was now trembling at the thought of losing the one thing that mattered most. But what would the doctor discover in that dimly lit clinic that would change both of their lives forever? But before we jump back into this heartwarming story together, tell us where you're tuning in from tonight. And if this tale truly touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you that you absolutely won't want to miss. Thomas McKenna had never been a man prone to reflection, but lately he found himself reaching for the worn leather journal hidden in his desk drawer more often than seemed proper for a man of his standing. The journal had been a gift from his late wife, Margaret, though he'd dismissed it as foolishness back then. "Write down your thoughts, Thomas," she'd said, with that gentle smile that could soften even his granite heart. "Someday, you might want to remember how you felt about things." He'd laughed at her then. Thomas McKenna, the largest cattle rancher in 3 counties, keeping a diary like some schoolgirl. The very notion had seemed absurd, yet here he sat, 15 years after Margaret's death, pen in hand, trying to make sense of the man he'd become since that October morning when he'd found a baby crying in the ruins of a burned-out homestead. McKenna Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of prime Colorado territory, carved from wilderness by Thomas's own sweat and determination. He'd arrived with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Those early years had been brutal. Indian raids, harsh winters, cattle rustlers who thought a lone man made for easy pickings. They'd learned otherwise, usually at the wrong end of Thomas's Colt 45. By the time he'd married Margaret in 1863, the ranch was already legendary. She'd civilized him somewhat, taught him there was more to life than branding cattle and counting dollars. For 7 beautiful years, they'd tried to build a family in this rough country, but the frontier took its toll on delicate things, and Margaret had withered away like a flower in drought, leaving Thomas more bitter and hardened than before. After her death, he'd thrown himself into expanding the ranch with ruthless efficiency. He employed 47 men, owned 6,000 head of cattle, and controlled enough land to make senators take notice. The town of Cedar Ridge had grown up around his influence, and bank presidents from Denver sought his counsel. Thomas McKenna was a man who commanded respect through sheer force of will and the weight of his success. But success hadn't filled the hollow space where his heart used to be. That changed on October 15th, 1878, when smoke rising from the direction of Bitter Creek drew his attention. He'd ridden out expecting to chase off squatters, only to find the smoldering remains of a small cabin and a tragedy that would alter the course of his life forever. The bodies of a young black couple lay in the yard, victims of what appeared to be a brutal robbery. They'd been heading west, probably seeking a fresh start in California, when someone had decided their modest possessions were worth taking 2 lives. What stopped Thomas cold was the sound coming from inside the burned cabin, the weak cry of an infant who'd somehow survived the carnage. He'd found her in a wooden box beneath an overturned table, maybe 6 months old, with the biggest brown eyes he'd ever seen. She was thin, dehydrated, probably hadn't eaten in days. Any reasonable man would have taken her to the sheriff. Let the authorities figure out what to do with an orphaned black child in territory where such children had few prospects and fewer protectors. Thomas McKenna had never considered himself particularly reasonable. Instead, he'd wrapped the baby in his own coat and carried her home, stopping at the Mexican settlement south of town to find a woman willing to nurse her back to health. Elena Rodriguez, a widow with grown children and a heart bigger than her small adobe house, had taken one look at the dying infant and rolled up her sleeves. For 3 weeks, Thomas had ridden to Elena's house twice daily, watching over the baby's recovery with an intensity that surprised them both. "What will you name her, Signor McKenna?" Eleanor had asked when it became clear the child would survive. Thomas had stared at the tiny girl who'd begun to smile when she saw him coming. "Sarah," he'd said, remembering his wife's favorite name for the daughter they'd never had. "Her name is Sarah McKenna." The decision to legally adopt her had caused quite a stir in Cedar Ridge. A wealthy white rancher taking in a black child wasn't just unusual, it was scandalous. The lawyer had tried to dissuade him, the banker had expressed concerns about his reputation, and several of his business associates had made their disapproval painfully clear. Thomas had listened to their objections with the same patience. He showed rattlesnakes, then done exactly what he'd planned from the beginning. Now, 3 years later, Sarah was the center of his universe in ways that still amazed him. She'd learned to walk, holding onto his finger, spoken her first word while sitting on his lap during dinner, and absolutely refused to let anyone else tuck her into bed at night. The little girl who'd survived tragedy had brought light into corners of his soul he'd forgotten existed. She was bright beyond her years, with an endless curiosity about everything, from the names of wildflowers to why the cattle made different sounds. Elena had been teaching her Spanish alongside English, and she chattered easily in both languages, often mixing them in ways that made Thomas smile despite himself. Just last week, she'd asked why some of the townspeople looked at her with funny faces, and Thomas had struggled to explain prejudice to a 3-year-old without poisoning her innocent view of the world. "Some people haven't learned yet that what matters is in here," he'd told her, placing his hand over her heart. "Not out there," he'd added, gesturing to her face. She'd nodded solemnly, then asked if they could go feed the horses, and the moment had passed. But Thomas knew there would be harder questions coming, and he was determined to prepare her for a world that might not always be kind to a little black girl, even one with his name and protection. The ranch had become a different place since Sarah's arrival. The cook, a gruff man named Pete, who'd worked for Thomas for 8 years, now made special meals just to see her smile. The foreman, Jim Brady, had carved her a set of toy horses that she carried everywhere. Even the newest hands knew that showing kindness to the boss's little girl was the fastest way to secure their position. But it was the change in Thomas himself that Elena noticed most clearly. "You laugh now, Signor McKenna," she'd told him. "Just last month, while Sarah napped between them on Elena's front porch. Before you were like winter, cold and hard. Now you are like spring." Thomas had protested that he was still the same man, but deep down he knew Elena was right. Sarah had cracked something open inside him that he'd thought was permanently sealed. She'd made him remember what it felt like to worry about someone more than himself, to plan for a future that stretched beyond cattle prices and land acquisition. He'd started reading to her every night, sharing stories from the books Margaret had loved. He'd taught her to ride a gentle mare named Buttercup, laughing at her determination to gallop before she'd mastered walking the horse. He'd commissioned a dressmaker in Denver to create beautiful clothes befitting a rancher's daughter, and he'd opened an account at the bank for her education fund. Most surprising of all, he'd begun going to church again. Not because he'd suddenly found religion, but because Sarah had asked about the bell that rang on Sunday mornings, and Thomas had realized he wanted her to have every opportunity to find her own path in life. The congregation had welcomed them with varying degrees of warmth, but Reverend Caldwell had made it clear that all of God's children were welcome in his house. The journal entries from those early days showed a man wrestling with unexpected love. "She called me Papa today for the first time," he'd written 6 months after finding her. "I never knew 3 letters could carry such weight." And later, caught myself planning her 16th birthday party. Margaret would laugh at me, worried about a party 13 years away, but I want her to have everything I can give. Now, as Thomas closed the journal and prepared for bed, he could hear Sarah's soft breathing from the adjoining room. He'd moved her bed closer to his after a nightmare had left her crying for comfort. and most nights he found reassurance in that gentle sound. Tomorrow would bring the usual challenges: cattle to move, fences to mend, books to balance. But tonight, all was well in the McKenna house. He had no way of knowing that before another sunset, his greatest fear would nearly come to pass, and the depth of his love for his adopted daughter would be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. Outside his window, the Colorado wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of approaching autumn and the promise of change that comes with every turning season. Inside, a wealthy rancher who'd found his heart through an abandoned child slept peacefully beside the most precious thing he'd ever owned. Not land or cattle or gold, but the love of a little girl who'd chosen to call him Papa. The night Sarah's world tilted toward darkness began like any other. Thomas had read her favorite story about a brave little rabbit, tucked her blanket around her shoulders just so, and kissed her forehead while she drowsed. She'd seemed perfectly fine, perhaps a little quieter than usual during dinner, but nothing that raised any alarm in his experienced father's mind. It was just past midnight when her scream shattered the peaceful silence of the ranch house. Thomas bolted upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol beside his bed before his mind caught up to the sound. This wasn't the cry of an intruder or the yell of a ranch hand in trouble. This was pure agony from someone small and helpless, and it sent ice through his veins faster than any gunfight ever had. He found Sarah sitting up in bed, both hands pressed against her right ear, tears streaming down her face in the moonlight. Her usual bright chatter had been reduced to broken sobs and the terrible words that would haunt his memory. "Pa, my ear hurts. It hurts so bad." Thomas scooped her into his arms, feeling the fever radiating from her small body like heat from a forge. She was burning up, and when he gently tried to examine her ear in the lamplight, she screamed again at even the softest touch. "I know, sweetheart, I know," he murmured, his own hands shaking as he tried to comfort her. But nothing he did seemed to help. The cool cloths he'd used for her previous minor fevers were useless against this kind of pain. She wouldn't stop crying, wouldn't stop pressing her hands against her ear, and with each passing minute, her fever seemed to climb higher. Thomas McKenna had faced down armed rustlers without breaking a sweat, but watching his little girl suffer left him feeling more helpless than he'd ever been in his life. By 2 in the morning, he knew he needed help beyond what he could provide. Sarah's breathing had become rapid and shallow, and she'd stopped responding to his voice with anything more than whimpers. Fear clawed at his chest as he made the decision that would change everything. He had to get Doc Harriman, no matter what it took. The doctor lived in town, a hard 5-mile ride under the best conditions. At night, with the mountain path treacherous and his mind consumed with worry, it might as well have been 50 miles. Thomas wrapped Sarah in his warmest coat, bundled her against his chest, and saddled Thunder, his fastest horse, by lamplight. "Just hold on to Papa," he told her as they began the desperate ride. "We're going to get help, sweet girl. Doc Harriman's going to make you feel better." But Sarah barely acknowledged his words, her small body limp against him, and Thomas found himself pushing Thunder harder than he ever had before. The night air cut through his clothes like knives, and every jolt of Thunder's hooves seemed to make Sarah whimper. Thomas tried to shield her from the wind while maintaining control of the horse, all the while fighting panic that threatened to cloud his judgment. He'd never been a praying man, but somewhere between the ranch and town, he found himself bargaining with whatever power might be listening. Cedar Ridge slept peacefully in the pre-dawn darkness, unaware that Thomas McKenna was about to wake half the town with his urgent need. Doc Harriman's house sat at the end of Main Street, a modest 2-story building with living quarters upstairs and his medical practice below. Thomas didn't bother with polite knocking. He pounded on the door hard enough to wake the dead, calling the doctor's name with increasing desperation. "Doc! Doc Harriman! It's Thomas McKenna. I need you now." It took several minutes, but finally a lamp flickered to life in an upstairs window, followed by the sound of footsteps on wooden stairs. Doc Harriman opened the door, wearing a hastily thrown-on robe. His grey hair disheveled from sleep, but his eyes immediately sharpened when he saw the bundle in Thomas's arms. "Bring her inside quickly," Doc said, already moving toward his examination room. "What are her symptoms?" "Ear pain. Started about 2 hours ago," Thomas replied, following the doctor's steady movements. "High fever, won't stop crying. Doc, I've never seen her like this." Doc Harriman was in his 60s, with gentle hands weathered by decades of frontier medicine. His black leather medical bag sat always ready beside his examination table, filled with instruments and medicines that represented the best medical knowledge available in their remote corner of Colorado. Tonight, that bag would determine Sarah's fate. He lit several lamps to brighten the room, then carefully took Sarah from Thomas's arms. She was barely conscious now, which worried Thomas even more than her earlier screaming. "Hold this lamp steady," Doc instructed, producing a small metal instrument from his bag. "I need to look in her ear." What he saw made him draw a sharp breath. "Thomas, this is more serious than a simple infection," he said quietly, his professional demeanor not quite hiding his concern. "The ear canal is severely inflamed, and I can see fluid build up behind the eardrum. If this isn't treated properly, she could lose her hearing permanently. Worse, the infection could spread to her brain." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. He'd been prepared for something manageable, something that could be fixed with medicine and time. But the look on Doc Harriman's face suggested they were dealing with something far more dangerous. "What do we do?" Thomas asked, surprised by how hoarse his own voice sounded. "For now, I can give her something for the pain and fever," Doc replied, already mixing a careful dose of laudanum. "But Thomas, I have to be honest with you. This type of severe ear infection often requires surgical intervention to prevent permanent damage. The kind of delicate work that's beyond my capabilities here." The implications hung heavy in the small room. Cedar Ridge was a long way from major cities with skilled surgeons. Getting Sarah to proper medical care would mean a dangerous journey. While she was critically ill, and even then, there were no guarantees. "We'll do whatever it takes," Thomas said firmly, watching as Doc carefully administered the pain medication. "Whatever she needs, whatever it costs." Doc Harriman nodded, but Thomas caught the slight hesitation in the older man's movement. "Thomas, you should know that some folks in town are already talking about your situation with Sarah. If word gets out that you're spending serious money on medical care for her, especially if it means taking her to Denver or Colorado Springs, there might be some ugly reactions." Thomas's jaw tightened. He'd known that adopting Sarah would bring challenges, but he'd hoped that 3 years of proving his commitment might have softened some attitudes. Apparently, he'd been naive. "Let them talk," he said quietly. "She's my daughter, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect her." The medicine was starting to take effect. Sarah's rigid posture relaxed slightly, and her breathing became more regular, but Doc Harriman's expression remained grave as he packed his instruments back into the leather bag that had delivered both hope and harsh reality. "I'll stay with her through the night," Doc offered. "Monitor her condition and adjust the medication as needed. But Thomas, you need to start thinking about the difficult decisions ahead. This infection is aggressive, and time isn't on our side." As dawn broke over the mountains, Thomas sat beside Sarah's small form on Doc Harriman's examination table, stroking her hair while she slept fitfully. The leather medical bag sat nearby, silent witness to the crossroads they'd reached. Everything he'd built, everything he'd accumulated over the years, suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the fragile life of the little girl who'd taught him what love really meant. Outside, Cedar Ridge was waking up to another ordinary day, unaware that the man who controlled much of their economic destiny was facing the greatest challenge of his life. By evening, word would spread through the town about Thomas McKenna's midnight ride and the sick child who'd caused such a commotion. Some would offer sympathy and support. Others would see opportunity in his distraction and weakness. But Thomas McKenna had learned something about himself in those dark hours before dawn. There was no price too high, no sacrifice too great, no social consequence too severe to stop him from fighting for Sarah's life. The wealthy rancher who'd once measured success in acres and cattle now had a different accounting system entirely, and he was prepared to spend everything. The morning brought little relief from the long night's vigil. Sarah's fever had broken sometime near dawn, but Doc Harriman's expression remained troubled as he examined her in the clearer light. The preliminary treatment had stabilized her condition without eliminating the underlying infection, leaving them in a precarious balance between hope and worry. "The laudanum helped with the immediate pain," Doc explained quietly, while Sarah dozed on his examination table. "But we're treating symptoms, not causes. The infection is deep-seated, and my instruments aren't precise enough for the kind of intervention she really needs." Thomas nodded, though each word felt like another weight added to his chest. He'd spent the sleepless hours studying his daughter's face, memorizing every detail, while fear whispered that he might lose the most important person in his world. The frontier had always been harsh, but he'd never imagined it would threaten the one thing he couldn't bear to lose. Sarah stirred, her brown eyes opening slowly to focus on Thomas's worried face. Despite everything she'd endured through the night, she managed a weak smile that nearly broke his heart. "Papa's here," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying but still carrying that sweet tone that could dissolve his sternest resolve. "I'm right here, sweetheart," he replied, taking her small hand in his much larger one. "How do you feel?" She considered the question with the seriousness that made her seem older than her 3 years. "My ear still hurts, but not like the scary hurt from before. Can we go home soon?" The simple request carried such trust, such confidence, that her papa could fix anything, that Thomas had to clear his throat before answering. "We need to make sure you're all better first. But yes, we'll go home soon." Doc Harriman watched this exchange with the gentle understanding of a man who'd witnessed countless family crises over his long career. "Thomas, I'd like to keep her here for observation today. The infection could flare up again, and if it does, we need to act quickly." It was a reasonable medical precaution. But Thomas chafed at the thought of spending the day in town where curious eyes would dissect every detail of their situation. Still, Sarah's welfare took precedence over his discomfort with public attention. "Whatever you think is best, Doc," he agreed. "But she'll want some of her things from home. Her doll especially. She doesn't sleep well without it." Sarah's face lit up at the mention of her cherished possession. "Yes, Maria needs to know I'm okay too." The doll in question was a simple creation of cloth and yarn sewn by Elena Rodriguez during Sarah's first weeks of recovery 3 years ago. Elena had crafted it to resemble Sarah herself, with brown yarn for hair and a dress made from scraps of colorful fabric. Over time, Maria had become Sarah's constant companion, confidant, and comfort during difficult moments. Thomas smiled, despite his worry. "I'll ride back and get Maria, along with some of your other favorite things. Will you be a good girl for Doc Harriman while I'm gone?" Sarah nodded solemnly, then surprised them both by reaching out to pat Doc's hand. "Don't worry. Doc Papa always comes back. He promised me he would, always and always." The simple faith in those words settled something in Thomas's chest. He kissed Sarah's forehead, spoke quietly with Doc about what to watch for, and prepared for the ride back to the ranch. Cedar Ridge was fully awake now, and Thomas's passage through town didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Henderson stopped sweeping her front steps to stare openly. Jake Morrison, the feed store owner, paused in loading a wagon to watch Thomas ride by. At the barber shop, several men clustered near the window, their conversations stopping as he passed. Thomas had expected curiosity, but the undercurrent of disapproval in some of those stares reminded him that not everyone in Cedar Ridge supported his unconventional family situation. 3 years of providing jobs and contributing to the town's economy had earned him respect and tolerance, but apparently not universal acceptance. The ride to the ranch gave him time to think about Doc's words regarding difficult decisions ahead. If Sarah needed surgery beyond what frontier medicine could provide, he'd have to take her to Denver or even further east. Such a journey would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially dangerous for a sick child. More importantly, it would signal to every business rival and social critic exactly how much the little black girl meant to him. Let them draw their conclusions, Thomas decided grimly. Sarah's life was worth more than maintaining any facade of emotional distance. Back at the ranch, he moved through the house, gathering Sarah's essential comfort items. Maria the doll sat propped against Sarah's pillow, as if waiting for her return. He also packed her favorite blanket, a picture book about animals, and the small wooden horses that Jim Brady had carved for her. As he prepared for the return trip to town, Elena Rodriguez arrived at the ranch house, her lined face creased with worry. "Senor McKenna, I heard in town about little Sarah," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "Is she very sick?" Thomas paused in securing Sarah's bundle to his saddle. Elena had been more than a caregiver. During Sarah's infancy, she'd become like a grandmother to the child, and her concern was genuine. "Her ear infection is serious, Elena. Doc's doing what he can, but he thinks she might need surgery that can't be done here." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained strong. "That little girl has survived worse, Senor McKenna. She has the heart of a fighter, just like her papa." She paused, seeming to wrestle with her words. "But I must tell you, there is talk in town. Some people say it is not natural for a man to care so much for a child not of his blood." Thomas's jaw tightened. "What exactly are they saying, Elena?" "Foolish things," she replied with disgust. "Mrs. Carpenter was at the market this morning, telling anyone who would listen that you should let the church handle the situation. That it's not proper for a single man to raise a colored child." Senora Henderson agreed, saying it gives the town a bad reputation. The anger that rose in Thomas's chest was cold and controlled, the kind that had made rustlers think twice about crossing him in the old days. "And what did you tell them?" Elena's smile was fierce despite her tears. "I told them they should worry more about the blackness of their own hearts and less about the color of an innocent child's skin. And I reminded them that God judges us by how we treat the helpless, not by how we follow the cruel customs of men." Thomas found himself smiling for the first time since Sarah's crisis began. "Elena, you're worth 10 of those gossiping women. I spoke only the truth, Signor, but you should know that not everyone thinks like those foolish ones. Many people admire what you have done for Sarah. Father Miguel says it shows the true meaning of Christian love." As Thomas prepared to ride back to town, Elena touched his arm gently. "Senor McKenna, if you need to take Sarah away for treatment, you must do it. Do not let the small minds of small people influence such an important decision." The wisdom in her words resonated as he rode toward Cedar Ridge, Sarah's beloved doll secure in his saddlebags. Thomas had built his success by making calculated decisions based on practical considerations, but this situation transcended such simple logic. The little girl waiting for him in Doc's clinic had changed him in ways he was still discovering, and her crisis was forcing him to confront truths about himself and his community that couldn't be measured in dollars or acres. When he arrived back at Doc's office, Sarah's face transformed with joy at the sight of Maria. She clutched the doll close, immediately beginning a whispered conversation about their adventure and how brave they were both being. "She's been asking about that doll every few minutes," Doc observed quietly. "It seems to anchor her somehow." Thomas watched his daughter comfort her toy with the same gentle words he'd used to comfort her, and realized that Sarah was learning more than just endurance from this trial. She was discovering the power of love to sustain hope even in frightening circumstances. It was a lesson he was learning too. By the third day, Sarah's condition had stabilized into an uncomfortable routine of moderate pain, manageable fever, and restless sleep. The crisis had passed without resolution. She was no longer in immediate danger, but neither was she improving significantly. Doc Harriman's treatments kept her comfortable, but the underlying infection remained stubbornly entrenched. Thomas spent those long hours in the clinic's quiet rooms, wrestling with decisions that seemed to multiply rather than clarify with each passing day. During one particularly still afternoon, while Sarah napped with Maria clutched against her chest, he found his thoughts drifting to the faded photograph hidden in his desk drawer back at the ranch. Margaret had been photographed on their wedding day, her gentle smile captured forever in sepia tones that had softened with age. Thomas rarely looked at that image anymore. The pain of loss had gradually given way to a kind of protective numbness. But Sarah's crisis had stirred memories he'd thought permanently buried. "You're thinking about your wife," Eleanor observed, quietly. She'd been arriving each morning to help with Sarah's care, bringing fresh clothes and homemade soup that the little girl barely touched. Thomas glanced up, surprised by Elena's perception. "How did you know?" "A man gets a certain look when he remembers deep love," Elena replied, settling into the chair beside him. "I see it sometimes when my husband's picture catches the light just right." "Tell me about her." It had been years since Thomas had spoken Margaret's name aloud, but something about the quiet clinic and his worry over Sarah loosened the careful control he'd maintained. "Margaret was everything I wasn't. Gentle, patient, full of hope. She saw good in people I was ready to write off as worthless. She believed in second chances, in the power of kindness to change hearts." "She sounds like someone who would have loved Sarah very much," Elena said softly. Thomas nodded, feeling the truth of that statement settle in his chest. "Margaret always wanted children. We tried for 7 years, but—" He paused, the old grief still sharp enough to catch his breath. "She said God would provide when the time was right. I thought it was just something she told herself to ease." "The disappointment. Perhaps she was more right than either of you knew," Elena suggested, glancing toward the small figure sleeping peacefully nearby. The conversation stirred memories of that October morning when he'd found Sarah and Thomas. Found himself describing the scene he'd never fully shared with anyone. "When I saw her in that burned cabin, barely alive and completely helpless, something cracked open inside me. Not just pity or duty, something deeper. It was like Margaret was whispering in my ear, telling me this was the child we'd been waiting for." Elena listened with the patience of someone who understood that some stories needed to be told in their own time. "And now I can't imagine life without her," Thomas admitted. "The ranch, the money, all of it means nothing compared to making sure she's safe and loved. But Elena, what if I'm not enough? What if my love isn't sufficient to protect her from a world that sees her as different?" Before Elena could answer, the clinic door opened with a sharp bang that startled Sarah awake. 3 men entered without invitation: Jake Morrison from the feed store, Bill Carpenter, whose wife had been spreading gossip, and Frank Walsh, a newer resident who'd made his disapproval of Thomas's situation clear on previous occasions. "McKenna," Morrison said without preamble, "we need to have a conversation." Thomas stood slowly, every instinct sharpened by the obvious hostility in the men's demeanor. "Keep your voices down. There's a sick child trying to rest." "That's exactly what we want to discuss," Carpenter replied, though he did lower his tone slightly. "This whole situation has gone too far. You're making a spectacle of yourself over that—" He paused, glancing at Sarah. "Over that child." The careful control Thomas had learned over years of business dealings began to fray. "Her name is Sarah, and she's my daughter. What I do for her is none of your concern." Walsh stepped forward, his face flushed with the kind of righteousness that often accompanied narrow minds. "It becomes our concern when it affects the whole town. People are talking, McKenna. They're saying Cedar Ridge is the place where white men raise colored children like their family. That's not the kind of reputation that attracts respectable settlers." Thomas felt the familiar cold anger settling in his chest, the same dangerous calm that had preceded more than one violent confrontation in his younger days. "And what exactly are you suggesting I do about that?" "Send her away," Morrison said. Bluntly, there are church organizations that handle these situations properly, orphanages in Denver that specialize in caring for colored children. Let her be raised by her own people. Sarah stirred at the rising tension in the room, her fever-bright eyes opening to focus on the strange men talking in harsh whispers. Eleanor moved protectively closer to the examination table, her own expression darkening at the men's words. Her own people, Thomas repeated quietly, and both Elena and Doc Harriman, who had just entered from the back room, recognized the warning in his tone. "You know what we mean," Carpenter pressed. "She'll be happier with her own kind, and you can get back to being the man this town respects. This whole business has made you soft, McKenna. People are starting to wonder if you've lost your edge for making the hard decisions." Thomas stepped forward, and all three men instinctively moved back. Despite being in his 40s, Thomas McKenna still carried himself with the controlled power of a man accustomed to physical confrontation. "Gentlemen, let me make something crystal clear. Sarah is my daughter in every way that matters. She carries my name, sleeps under my roof, and has my complete protection. Anyone who has a problem with that arrangement is welcome to discuss it with me privately." "Now see here, McKenna," Walsh began, but Thomas cut him off with a gesture. "You're in a doctor's clinic disturbing a sick child and her family. I suggest you leave now before I decide that your behavior warrants a more direct response." "Docky." Harriman cleared his throat diplomatically. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid I must insist that you continue this discussion elsewhere. This is a medical facility, not a meeting hall." The three men exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that they'd pushed as far as they dared for one day, but Morrison couldn't resist a parting shot as they headed for the door. "This isn't over, McKenna. That child is going to bring nothing but trouble to this town, and when she does, remember that we tried to warn you." After they left, the silence in the clinic felt heavy with unspoken tensions. Sarah had watched the entire confrontation with wide eyes, and Thomas could see questions forming that he wasn't ready to answer. "Papa, why were those men angry about me?" she asked in her small voice. Thomas sat on the edge of the examination table and took her hand gently. "Some people haven't learned yet that families come in all different shapes and colors, sweetheart. But that's their problem, not ours." Elena moved to Sarah's other side, smoothing her hair with gentle fingers. "Your papa loves you more than all the gold in the mountains, Mija. That's all that matters." As the afternoon wore on, Thomas realized that Sarah's medical crisis had exposed something deeper than a simple ear infection. It had revealed the fault lines in his community, the limits of tolerance that prosperity and influence could buy. More importantly, it had clarified his own priorities in ways that 3 years of gradual change had not. The faded photograph of Margaret might remain hidden in his desk drawer, but her spirit lived on in the love he showed their chosen daughter. And that love, Thomas now understood, was worth defending against any force that threatened to diminish it. The confrontation had also taught him something crucial. The time for quiet compromise and gentle integration was over. If Cedar Ridge couldn't accept Sarah as his daughter, then perhaps Cedar Ridge wasn't where they belonged. But first, he had to make sure she was well enough to face whatever future awaited them. The church bell that rang across Cedar Ridge each Sunday morning had marked the rhythm of Thomas's weeks for as long as he'd lived in the territory. Its bronze voice carried across the valley with a clarity that seemed to organize the scattered settlement into something resembling a community. Now, listening to that familiar sound from Doc's clinic on their 5th day of vigil, Thomas found himself wondering whether that sense of belonging had ever been more than an illusion. Doc Harriman had requested a private conversation after his morning examination of Sarah, and his expression suggested the news wouldn't bring comfort. "Thomas, I've done everything within my capabilities," Doc began, settling heavily into his desk chair. "The infection has stabilized, but it hasn't resolved. Without proper surgical drainage, Sarah faces a real risk of permanent hearing loss. Or worse, complications. Thomas had been expecting this conversation, but hearing the words aloud still felt like a physical blow. "What are you recommending?" "There's a surgeon in Denver, Dr. Malcolm Brennan, who specializes in ear conditions. He's trained in the latest techniques and has instruments I simply don't possess here." Doc paused, choosing his words carefully. It would mean a difficult journey for a sick child, considerable expense, and several weeks away from home. The implications multiplied in Thomas's mind like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. A trip to Denver would mean closing the ranch's daily operations to his foreman Jim Brady, missing the crucial autumn cattle sales, and spending money he'd been saving for Sarah's education fund. More significantly, it would mean taking Sarah far from the only home she'd ever known while she was weak and vulnerable. "How dangerous would the surgery be?" Thomas asked. Doc's silence stretched uncomfortably long. "Any surgery carries risks, especially for a child. But Thomas, the alternative is almost certainly permanent damage. She could lose hearing in that ear entirely. And if the infection spreads..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Through the clinic's front window, Thomas could see the morning bustle of Cedar Ridge's main street. Wagons rolled past, carrying supplies and produce. Children ran between the buildings playing games that would be interrupted by school bells, and adults moved with the purposeful energy of people managing their daily responsibilities. It was a scene of ordinary life continuing while his world balanced on the edge of crisis. "I need to think about this," Thomas said finally, "and I need to discuss it with Sarah." Doc nodded understandingly. "Of course, but Thomas, time isn't on our side. Each day we wait increases the risk of complications." As if summoned by their conversation about her, Sarah appeared in the doorway between the examination room and Doc's office, moving carefully, but under her own power for the first time in days. She was pale and thin, but her eyes held their familiar spark of curiosity. "Are you talking about me?" she asked with the directness that never failed to surprise adults. Thomas lifted her onto his lap, marveling again at how light she felt. "We're talking about making you all better, sweetheart. Doc thinks we might need to take a trip to Denver to see another doctor." Sarah considered this information with her characteristic seriousness. "Is Denver very far away?" "Further than we've ever traveled together," Thomas admitted. "It would mean staying in a strange place for a while, away from the ranch and all your favorite spots." To his surprise, Sarah nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Like when Maria and I pretend to be explorers, except real." The simple comparison brought a smile to both men's faces, despite the gravity of the situation. "Something like that," Thomas agreed. "Will you be with me the whole time?" Sarah asked, and Thomas heard the slight uncertainty beneath her brave words. "Every single moment," he promised. "I wouldn't let anyone take care of you, except me." Later that afternoon, while Sarah napped with Maria tucked securely in her arms, Eleanor arrived with her usual offering of soup and gentle wisdom. She'd been coming faithfully each day, despite the social pressure Thomas knew she faced for supporting his unconventional family. "Elena," Thomas said as they sat in the clinic's quiet waiting area, "tell me about when you lost your husband." Elena's weathered hands stilled on her knitting. She rarely spoke about her own tragedies, preferring to focus her energy on helping others through theirs. "Why do you ask, Signor McKenna?" "Because I need to understand something about courage," Thomas replied honestly. "You've faced losing the person you loved most, and somehow you've survived it." "I'm not sure I have that kind of strength." Elena set down her knitting and folded her hands carefully in her lap. "My Roberto died in the silver mine collapse 8 years ago. One moment he was kissing me goodbye at breakfast. The next, I was identifying his body in the town undertaker's parlor." Her voice remained steady, but Thomas could see the old pain in her eyes. "For weeks afterward, I wanted to die too. I couldn't see the point of continuing without him." "What changed your mind?" Thomas asked quietly. "The children in our neighborhood started coming to me when they were hurt or frightened. Their parents worked long hours, and I had time and a gentle hand for scraped knees and bad dreams. Gradually, I realized that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new places to grow. Elena glanced toward the room where Sarah slept. When you brought that dying baby to my house 3 years ago, I saw Roberto's kindness living on through your actions. Love creates more love, Signor McKenna. It never truly disappears. Thomas absorbed this wisdom while the afternoon light shifted through the clinic windows. Elena, what if I make the wrong choice? What if taking Sarah to Denver makes things worse instead of better? Then you will face whatever comes with the same love that brought you this far. Elena replied simply. But Senor McKenna, I think the greater risk is in doing nothing from fear. That little girl in there has already survived abandonment, fever, and now this infection. She has the heart of a survivor because she knows she is loved completely. As if to prove Elena's point, Sarah's voice drifted from the examination room, singing softly to Maria about brave cowboys and their adventures. The melody was one Thomas had taught her, but she'd added her own words about facing scary things with someone you love beside you. She's not afraid, Thomas realized aloud. Children rarely are when they trust completely in their protector. Elena agreed. The question is whether you trust completely in your love for her. As the church bell marked the hour with its resonant bronze voice, Thomas understood that his decision was already made. The bell that had once symbolized his place in Cedar Ridge's community now seemed to be calling him toward a different kind of belonging, one measured not by social acceptance, but by the courage to do whatever love required. The ranch could survive without him for a few weeks. The cattle sales could be managed by Jim Brady. His business relationships could weather his temporary absence. But Sarah's future couldn't survive his fear. That evening, as sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas sat beside his daughter's bed and took her small hand in his. "Sarah, we're going to Denver," he said quietly. "It's going to be an adventure, just like you said. And when we come back, you're going to be all better." Sarah smiled, the first, genuinely joyful expression he'd seen from her in days. "Will we see trains in Denver and tall buildings like in the picture books? All of that and more," Thomas promised. "But most importantly, we'll see Dr. Brennan, who's going to fix your ear so it never hurts like this again." As he tucked the blankets around her small form, Thomas realized that Elena was right about love creating more love. His decision to take Sarah to Denver wasn't just about medical treatment. It was about choosing their bond over every other consideration, including the opinions of a town that had never fully embraced their family anyway. The church bell had marked countless Sundays in Cedar Ridge, but Thomas suspected it might be calling time on one chapter of their lives while announcing the beginning of another. The pocket watch had belonged to Thomas's father, a stern Pennsylvania farmer who died when Thomas was barely 16. Made of solid gold with intricate engravings that caught lamplight like tiny stars, it was the only inheritance Thomas had brought west when he'd left everything behind to build his fortune in Colorado Territory. For 25 years, that watch had marked the passage of time through cattle drives, business negotiations, and the slow accumulation of wealth that defined success on the frontier. Now, sitting in his ranch office while dawn painted the mountains pink, Thomas held the watch and contemplated decisions that would have horrified the practical man who'd raised him. The trip to Denver would cost more than most people earned in 2 years, and Thomas's liquid cash reserves weren't sufficient to cover both the journey and Dr. Brennan's surgical fees. He'd spent the past 2 days calculating options, and every path led to the same conclusion. He would need to sell a significant portion of his cattle herd immediately, accepting whatever price the market offered, rather than waiting for the premium prices that autumn auctions typically brought. Jim Brady knocked on the office door, then entered without waiting for permission, a familiarity earned through 8 years of loyal service as Thomas's foreman. "Boss, I got the word out like you asked. Harvey Mitchell from the Double Bar Ranch can take 500 head this week, but he's only offering 60% of market value. Says it's because you need quick sale." Thomas nodded grimly. Harvey Mitchell was a shrewd businessman who'd obviously heard about Sarah's situation and recognized an opportunity to acquire quality cattle at reduced prices. In the old days, Thomas might have respected such calculated opportunism. Now it simply felt like vultures circling wounded prey. "What about the other potential buyers?" Thomas asked. Jim shifted uncomfortably. "Most of them are giving similar terms, boss. Word's gotten around that you're in a tight spot, and they're all lowballing accordingly. There's something else, too." He paused, clearly struggling with difficult news. "Speak plainly, Jim. Some of the ranch hands are asking questions about their job security. They're wondering if selling off half the herd means layoffs come winter." Jim's weathered face showed genuine concern. "These are good men, Thomas. They've got families depending on this work." Thomas felt the weight of responsibility that came with employing 47 people settling heavier on his shoulders. His decision to prioritize Sarah's medical needs would ripple through dozens of families, affecting wives and children who had no say in his choices. "Tell the men their jobs are secure," Thomas said finally. "We'll rebuild the herd over time, but I won't let anyone go because of temporary financial pressure." Jim nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Boss, I have to ask, is this really worth risking everything you've built? I mean, the little girl is sweet as can be, but she's not my blood," Thomas finished quietly, recognizing the unspoken question that had been hovering around the ranch for days. "I didn't mean it like that," Jim protested, though his reddening face suggested otherwise. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vast expanse of land that represented decades of backbreaking work and calculated risks. "Jim, when you look at this ranch, what do you see?" "I see the most successful cattle operation in 3 counties, Jim replied honestly. "I see land and livestock worth more than most small towns. And when I look at Sarah, I see something worth more than all of it combined." Thomas turned back to face his foreman. "Make the deal with Mitchell. 500 head at his offered price. And Jim, anyone who has a problem with that decision is welcome to seek employment elsewhere." After Jim left, Thomas pulled his father's watch from his vest pocket and opened it to check the time. The photograph inside the cover showed his parents on their wedding day, 2 serious-faced people whose primary concern had been building financial security in an uncertain world. They'd succeeded by any measure that mattered to their generation, but they'd never experienced the kind of love that made such practical considerations seem secondary. Thomas was contemplating the irony of using his inheritance to fund Sarah's future when Doc Harriman arrived at the ranch, looking more haggard than Thomas had seen him since the crisis began. "Doc, what brings you out here? How's Sarah?" Doc accepted the offered whiskey gratefully before answering. "She had a better morning, fever down, less pain, even asked for breakfast. But Thomas, I need to be honest with you about something." The momentary hope that had flared in Thomas's chest died at Doc's grave expression. "What is it?" "I received a telegram response from Dr. Brennan in Denver. He's reviewed the symptoms I described and agreed to see Sarah, but he wanted me to prepare you for some difficult realities." Doc took a careful sip of whiskey. This type of advanced ear infection often involves complications that aren't immediately apparent. Even with successful surgery, there could be permanent effects, balance problems, partial hearing loss, or recurring infections. Thomas sank into his chair, feeling the full weight of uncertainty settling around him. "Are you saying the trip might not help?" "I'm saying it's Sarah's best chance, but we need to be realistic about outcomes. Dr. Brennan is excellent, but he's not a miracle worker." Doc leaned forward. "Thomas, there's something else. The journey itself poses risks for a child in her condition. The altitude changes, the stress of travel, being away from familiar surroundings, all of that could worsen her situation." The pocket watch ticked steadily in Thomas's hand, marking seconds that felt loaded with momentous consequence. "Doc, if she were your daughter, what would you do?" Doc Harriman had been practicing frontier medicine for 30 years, and his answer came without hesitation. I'd take her to Denver and pray that love and determination were enough to tip the scales in her favor. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drew both men to the window. Elena was arriving with Sarah bundled in her arms, the little girl looking more alert than she had in over a week. "Papa!" Sarah called out as Elena helped her down from the wagon. "I wanted to come home and see if the horses missed me." Thomas met them at the front door, marveling at the change in Sarah's demeanor. Her fever had clearly broken, her eyes were bright with curiosity rather than pain, and she moved with something approaching her normal energy. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" he asked, lifting her carefully. "Much better. Doc gave me medicine that tastes terrible, but makes my ear stop hurting. Can we visit Thunder? I want to tell him about our adventure to Denver." The improvement was so dramatic that Thomas felt a dangerous surge of hope. Maybe the infection had finally responded to treatment. Maybe the crisis was over, and they could return to their normal life without the expense and risk of the Denver journey. But when he caught Doc's eye over Sarah's head, the older man's slight shake warned against such optimism. Thomas had seen enough sick cattle recover temporarily before succumbing to underlying illness to recognize false hope when it appeared. "We'll visit Thunder after lunch," Thomas promised. "But Sarah, we're still planning our trip to Denver. Dr. Brennan is looking forward to meeting you." "Will we really see trains?" Sarah asked, her excitement genuine despite her recent suffering. "The biggest, loudest trains you can imagine," Thomas assured her, though privately he wondered whether they'd both have the strength for what lay ahead. As Elena helped Sarah get settled back in her familiar bedroom, Thomas found himself checking his father's pocket watch again. Time was moving forward, whether he was ready or not, carrying them all toward decisions that would reshape their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The cattle sale would provide the necessary funds. The business would survive his temporary absence, and his employees would adapt to whatever changes came. But none of those practical considerations mattered as much as the little girl who was currently explaining to her doll Maria about their upcoming grand adventure. Thomas McKenna had spent his adult life building an empire measured in acres and gold. Now he was preparing to risk it all for something that couldn't be quantified in any ledger book. The absolute certainty that Sarah's life was worth whatever sacrifice love demanded. The discovery that would change everything came while Thomas was packing Sarah's belongings for their departure to Denver. She'd been napping peacefully, her improved condition holding steady for the third consecutive day, when he decided to organize her clothes and personal items for the journey ahead. Maria the doll sat in her usual place of honor on Sarah's pillow, but as Thomas lifted the beloved toy to pack her carefully, he noticed something unusual. The doll's dress had been sewn with particular care, and tucked between the layers of fabric was a small bulge that he'd never noticed before. Curiosity overcoming his natural reluctance to disturb Sarah's most treasured possession, Thomas carefully examined the seam until he found a hidden pocket Elena had sewn into Maria's dress. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, was a folded piece of paper that had yellowed with age. Thomas unfolded the letter with trembling hands, immediately recognizing that the careful handwriting belonged to an educated person. The date at the top read September 12, 1878, just weeks before he'd found Sarah in that burned cabin. "My dearest daughter Sarah, if someone is reading this letter, then the worst has happened, and your mother and I have not survived to raise you as we planned. I pray that whoever finds you will show kindness to a helpless child, regardless of the color of her skin. Your name is Sarah Elizabeth Hayes, and you are the daughter of Professor William Hayes of the Friedman School in Denver, Colorado, and Mary Catherine Hayes, formerly of Charleston, South Carolina. We were traveling west to establish a new school for colored children in California when misfortune found us. Sarah, my precious child, you come from a family of teachers and scholars. Your grandmother was a freed slave who learned to read despite laws forbidding such education, and she passed that love of learning to your mother. I've dedicated my life to ensuring that children like you have opportunities that previous generations were denied. If you are being cared for by kind people, I hope this letter will help them understand that you deserve the finest education available. There is money deposited in the Merchants Bank of Denver under account number 847291, intended for your schooling. The account can be accessed with this letter as proof of your identity. Most importantly, know that you were loved completely from the moment you entered this world. Your mother sang to you every night, and I read to you from books that I pray will find their way into your hands someday. If fate has separated us, then I can only trust that God will provide other hearts to love you as we do. Your devoted father, Professor William Hayes Thomas, read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of implication that left him reeling. Sarah wasn't simply an orphaned child of unknown parentage. She was the daughter of an educated man who might still be alive, searching for the child he'd believed was dead. The implications crashed over Thomas in waves. If Professor Hayes had survived whatever tragedy had befallen Sarah's parents, if he was indeed still teaching in Denver, then Thomas had been raising another man's daughter for 3 years without that man's knowledge or consent. Worse, the letter revealed that Sarah came from a world of education and intellectual achievement that Thomas, despite his business success, could never fully provide. Professor Hayes spoke of books, schools, and opportunities that were far beyond what frontier life in Cedar Ridge could offer. Thomas sank into the chair beside Sarah's bed, studying her sleeping face with new eyes. The intelligence that had always impressed him, the quick way she learned languages and concepts, the natural curiosity that seemed to drive her exploration of the world. All of these traits suddenly took on new significance. She wasn't just a bright child. She was the daughter of scholars, carrying genetic gifts that deserved proper cultivation. But the revelation that shook him most profoundly was the realization that he might have to give her up. If Professor Hayes was alive, if he'd been searching for his daughter all these years, then what right did Thomas have to keep them apart? The love he felt for Sarah was real and deep, but it was built on a foundation of ignorance about her true identity. Now that he knew the truth, could he justify maintaining the separation? The ethical implications tormented him as he sat in the gathering dusk, listening to Sarah's peaceful breathing. She knew no father but him, no family but the makeshift one they'd created on the ranch. Introducing her to her biological father would potentially disrupt the only secure attachment she'd ever known. Yet keeping her from Professor Hayes seemed equally wrong. If the man was still alive, still teaching, still mourning the daughter he believed was dead, then he deserved to know that Sarah had survived. Thomas was still wrestling with these impossible questions when Sarah stirred, her eyes opening to focus on his troubled face. "Papa, why do you look sad?" she asked, sitting up to study him with the perceptiveness that never failed to surprise him. "I'm just thinking about grown-up things, sweetheart," Thomas replied, quickly folding the letter and slipping it into his pocket. "How do you feel?" "My ear doesn't hurt at all right now," Sarah said, brightening. "Does that mean we don't have to go to Denver?" The innocent question felt like a knife twisting in Thomas's chest. Denver, where Professor Hayes taught at the Friedman School. Denver, where Sarah's true heritage waited to be discovered. Denver, where Thomas might lose the most important relationship of his life. "We're still going to Denver," Thomas said, gently. "Doc wants to make sure you stay healthy, and I want you to see all those things we talked about, the trains and tall buildings." Sarah nodded, accepting his explanation with the trust that made the deception even more painful. "Papa, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. Do you think my first parents loved me? Before they died, I mean?" The question, coming so soon after his discovery of the letter, nearly broke Thomas's composure. "Why do you ask that?" "Sarah? Sometimes I dream about a lady who sang to me and a man who read stories with a deep voice like yours. Elena says that's probably my mama and papa from before. I just wonder if they were sad when they couldn't take care of me anymore." Thomas lifted Sarah onto his lap, marveling at how a child's intuition could sometimes approach truths that adults struggle to comprehend. "Sarah, I know they loved you very much. Parents don't stop loving their children just because they can't. Be with them, like how you'd still love me even if something happened and we got separated," Sarah asked. The parallel she'd drawn was so apt that Thomas had to clear his throat before answering. "Exactly like that. Love doesn't end just because people can't be together." After tucking Sarah back into bed with promises of exciting adventures ahead, Thomas retreated to his office and read Professor Hayes's letter again by lamplight. The final paragraph haunted him. "If fate has separated us, then I can only trust that God will provide other hearts to love you as we do." Had God provided Thomas's heart as temporary shelter until Sarah could be reunited with her father? Or was Professor Hayes's love meant to be a memory while Thomas's love shaped her future? The questions had no easy answers, but Thomas realized that the decision couldn't be made in ignorance. He needed to know whether Professor Hayes was still alive, still in Denver, still mourning the daughter he believed was lost. Only with that information could he make a choice that served Sarah's best interests rather than his own desperate desire to keep her. The next morning, Thomas composed a careful telegram to be sent to the Freedman School in Denver. "Professor William Hayes, stop, have information regarding your daughter Sarah. Stop, will be in Denver next week for medical treatment. Stop, request, meeting to discuss urgent matter. Stop. Thomas McKenna, Cedar Ridge, Colorado, stoppers." He handed the telegram to the operator in town. Thomas felt like he was gambling with his entire future. If Professor Hayes responded, if he was indeed searching for Sarah, then the trip to Denver would become far more complicated than a simple medical consultation. But as he watched Sarah playing with Maria in the wagon, chattering excitedly about their upcoming adventure, Thomas knew he couldn't build her future on a foundation of lies. Whatever the cost to his own happiness, Sarah deserved to know the truth about her heritage and to have the choice of reclaiming her original identity. The telegram disappeared into the network of wires that connected frontier towns to distant cities, carrying with it the power to reunite a father with his lost daughter, or to confirm that the family Thomas and Sarah had built was indeed meant to last. Either way, the truth was finally traveling toward its destination, and there would be no turning back from whatever revelation awaited them in Denver. The train tickets arrived from Denver, along with 2 telegrams that would reshape Thomas's understanding of the journey ahead. He held the heavy cardboard tickets, first-class accommodations that Sarah had specifically requested after learning that trains had fancy seats like thrones, while reading messages that carried the weight of destiny. The first telegram was from Dr. Brennan's office, confirming Sarah's appointment and outlining the surgical procedure that would either restore her hearing completely or leave her with permanent impairment. Clinical language that reduced his daughter's future to medical probabilities and statistical outcomes. The second telegram made his hands tremble. "Mr. McKenna, stop, your message received with overwhelming joy. Stop, have searched for my daughter Sarah. For 3 years, Stop believed she perished with her mother. Stop will meet you at Brown Palace Hotel, Monday, October 15th. Stop, Professor William Hayes. Freedman School, Denver. Stop, God bless you for caring for my child. Stop." Thomas read Professor Hayes's message so many times that the words blurred together. The joy in that telegram, the gratitude, the assumption that Thomas had been a temporary guardian rather than a father, all of it pointed toward a reunion that would fundamentally alter Sarah's life and potentially end Thomas's role in it. He'd known this possibility existed from the moment he found the letter in Maria's dress, but seeing it confirmed in stark telegraph language made the reality inescapable. In 5 days, he would sit across from another man who had an equal, perhaps superior, claim to Sarah's love and future. The thought terrified him more than facing armed rustlers ever had. Sarah found him in his office that evening, staring at The train tickets spread across his desk like tarot cards, revealing an uncertain future. "Papa, why do you keep looking at those tickets like they might disappear?" she asked, climbing onto his lap with the casual familiarity that never failed to warm his heart. "I'm just making sure everything is perfect for our adventure," Thomas replied, though his voice carried a weight that Sarah's perceptive ears detected. "Is something scary going to happen in Denver?" she asked, turning to study his face with those remarkable brown eyes that seemed to see straight through adult pretenses. Thomas considered how much truth a 3-year-old could handle. "Sarah, sometimes grown-ups have to make important decisions, and that can feel scary even when it might lead to good things," she nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "Like when I had to decide to let Doc look in my ear even though it might hurt because it would help me get better." "Exactly. Like that?" Thomas agreed, marveling at her ability to distill complex situations into manageable concepts. "Well, then it's okay to be scared," Sarah declared with the confidence of someone who'd faced her own fears recently. "But Papa, you know I'll be brave if you're brave too." The simple faith in those words nearly undid Thomas's carefully maintained composure. How could he explain that her courage might not be enough to keep their family intact? Over the next 3 days, Thomas threw himself into preparations that went far beyond packing for a medical trip. He wrote detailed letters to Jim Brady outlining ranch operations for an extended absence, settled accounts with suppliers who might need payment during his time away, and arranged for legal documents that would allow the foreman to make necessary decisions in Thomas's absence. But it was the personal letter he wrote to Elena that revealed the true depth of his fears. "Elena, if something happens that prevents my return, or if circumstances in Denver change our family situation permanently, please know that you have been more than a caregiver to Sarah. You have been her grandmother in every way that matters. The bank account I've established for her education contains enough to ensure she never wants for anything, regardless of who raises her. I pray that Sarah and I will return to Cedar Ridge together, but if we don't, please remember us as we were. During these 3 years when love made us a real family, despite what anyone else might have said about the unconventional nature of our bond." The letter remained unsealed on his desk, a testament to possibilities he couldn't bear to speak aloud. Elena arrived at the ranch the morning before their departure, bringing Sarah's favorite foods for the journey and wearing an expression that suggested she'd intuited more about this trip than Thomas had explicitly shared. "Senor McKenna," she said quietly while Sarah played with her dolls in the next room, "there is something different about this journey. I see it in your eyes. Not just worry about the surgery, but something deeper." Thomas hesitated, then decided Elena deserved the truth. He showed her Professor Hayes's letter, watching her face change as she absorbed the implications. "Dios mío," Elena whispered. "Her father is alive and searching for her," Thomas confirmed. "Elena, what if I've been wrong to keep her? What if she belongs with him, in a world where she can receive the education and opportunities that her heritage demands?" Elena folded the letter carefully before answering. "Senor McKenna, love is not about what we deserve or what others think we should have. It is about what grows in the heart when we care for each other day after day, year after year." She looked toward the room where Sarah's laughter could be heard. "That little girl calls you Papa because you have earned that title through devotion, not because of blood or law. But if Professor Hayes can give her advantages, I cannot. Then perhaps the question is not who should raise her, but how all the people who love her can work together for her happiness." Elena's wisdom, as always, cut through Thomas's fears. To reveal possibilities he hadn't considered, Doc Harriman's final examination of Sarah took place the evening before their departure, and his assessment was cautiously optimistic. "The infection has stabilized, and she's strong enough for the journey. Dr. Brennan should have excellent conditions for the surgery." After examining Sarah, Doc requested a private conversation with Thomas in his office. Thomas, in all my years of practice, I've seen many kinds of love between parents and children. What you've built with Sarah is remarkable, not because it's unusual, but because it's genuine. Doc poured 2 glasses of medicinal whiskey. Whatever happens in Denver, don't let anyone convince you that your love for her is less valid than biological connection. But what if she's better off with her real father? Thomas asked. Her real father is the man who held her through fever, who read her bedtime stories, who would sell his ranch to pay for her medical care. Doc's voice carried the authority of someone who'd witnessed countless family situations. Biology creates potential, Thomas. Love creates family. The final evening at the ranch passed with deceptive normalcy. Sarah insisted on saying goodbye to each of her favorite horses, explaining to them about the grand adventure ahead and promising to bring back stories of trains and tall buildings. She packed Maria with the same care she'd seen Thomas use for important documents, wrapping the doll in her softest blanket. Maria's never been on a train either, Sarah explained seriously. She's probably nervous, so I need to make sure she feels safe. As Thomas tucked Sarah into bed for what might be their last night in the only home she'd ever known, she surprised him with a question that suggested she understood more about their situation than she'd revealed. Papa, if we meet new people in Denver, will you still be my papa afterward? The question hit Thomas like a physical blow, revealing that Sarah's perceptive mind had detected undercurrents he'd tried to hide. Sarah, no matter what happens, no matter who we meet, I will always love you more than all the stars in the sky. You will always be my daughter. She nodded, satisfied with this promise, and drifted off to sleep holding Maria close. Thomas spent that final night walking through the ranch house, memorizing details he'd taken for granted. Sarah's drawings on the kitchen wall, her small boots, beside his large ones at the door, the way moonlight fell across her sleeping face through bedroom windows that perfectly framed the mountain vista beyond. At dawn, as they loaded their belongings into the wagon for the ride to the train station, Thomas felt like he was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The train tickets in his pocket represented more than transportation to medical care. They were passage to a confrontation with truth that would determine whether love was strong enough to transcend questions of blood and belonging. Sarah chattered excitedly about the adventure ahead, completely trusting that her papa would guide her safely through whatever challenges awaited. Thomas hoped her faith would prove justified, even as he prepared for the possibility that their family of 2 was about to become something entirely different. The morning train whistle echoed across the valley, calling them toward Denver and the meeting that would reshape their understanding of what family really meant. Denver rose from the plains like a promise of civilization, its brick buildings and bustling streets, a stark contrast to the open ranges Thomas and Sarah had left behind. The train journey had exhausted Sarah despite her initial excitement, and she clung to Maria while pressing her face against Thomas's chest as they navigated the crowded platform. "Papa, there are so many people," she whispered, overwhelmed by the noise and movement that surrounded them. "Stay close to me, sweetheart," Thomas replied, shouldering their bags while keeping one protective arm around her small form. "We're going to a nice hotel where you can rest before we see the doctor tomorrow." But even as he spoke reassuring words, Thomas's eyes searched the crowd for a face that might belong to Professor William Hayes. The telegram had mentioned the Brown Palace Hotel, and Thomas found himself studying every well-dressed black man they passed, wondering if he was looking at Sarah's father without knowing it. Dr. Brennan's office occupied the top floor of Denver's most modern medical building, a 4-story structure with electric lights and an elevator that made Sarah gasp. With wonder and fear in equal measure, the surgeon himself proved to be a precise man in his 50s, with the kind of steady hands and calm demeanor that inspired confidence in desperate parents. "Mr. McKenna, please have a seat," Dr. Brennan said, after his thorough examination of Sarah. Young lady, you may play with your doll while your father and I discuss your treatment." The word father hit Thomas with unexpected force, carrying implications that would soon be tested by truth. He settled Sarah in a comfortable chair with Maria before joining Dr. Brennan at his desk. The infection has created significant damage to the middle ear structures, Dr. Brennan explained, showing Thomas detailed anatomical drawings that made the problem seem both more serious and more fixable. "Surgery is definitely required to prevent permanent hearing loss, but I must be frank about the risks." The surgeon's scalpel sat on his instrument tray, its blade catching afternoon light that streamed through tall windows. That small piece of sharpened steel would determine whether Sarah's world remained full of sound or fell into partial silence. "What kind of risks?" Thomas asked, though his stomach already knew the answer wouldn't be comfortable. "Any surgery involving such delicate structures carries the possibility of complete hearing loss in that ear. There's also risk from the chloroform anesthesia, especially in young children. And post-surgical infections, while rare, can be life-threatening." Dr. Brennan's honesty was brutal but necessary. However, without surgery, she will almost certainly lose hearing in that ear, and the infection could spread to more dangerous areas. Thomas looked at Sarah, who was whispering secrets to Maria with the unconscious trust of a child who believed adults would keep her safe. "Doctor, if she were your daughter, would you proceed with the surgery?" "Without hesitation, Doctor," Brennan replied immediately. "But I want you to understand that even successful surgery may not restore her hearing to normal levels. She may need special accommodations for learning and social development." Before Thomas could respond, a soft knock interrupted their consultation. Dr. Brennan's assistant entered with an apologetic expression. "Doctor, there's a gentleman in the waiting room who says he has an appointment to discuss the patient. Professor Hayes?" Thomas felt his world tilt on its axis. "Please ask him to wait. We'll be finished here shortly." After scheduling Sarah's surgery for the following morning and receiving detailed pre-operative instructions, Thomas faced the moment he'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. He lifted Sarah, who had dozed in her chair, and carried her to the waiting room where her future waited to be redefined. Professor William Hayes stood when they entered, and Thomas immediately saw Sarah's eyes looking back at him from a face that bore the unmistakable stamp of shared heritage. The man was tall, dignified, with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command through intelligence rather than force. For a long moment, the two men studied each other while Sarah stirred drowsily in Thomas's arms. "Mr. McKenna," Professor Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying the same warm tone that Thomas had noticed in Sarah's speech. "I cannot adequately express my gratitude for caring for my daughter." "She's been my privilege to raise," Thomas replied, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "Professor Hayes, there's much we need to discuss." Sarah chose that moment to wake fully, her gaze moving between the two men with the quick intelligence that had always impressed Thomas. She studied Professor Hayes with the same careful attention she gave to all new experiences. "Sarah," Thomas said gently, "this is Professor Hayes. He's a teacher, like Elena told you your first father was." Professor Hayes knelt to Sarah's eye, level tears openly streaming down his face. "Hello, Sarah. You've grown into such a beautiful, strong little girl." Sarah looked at Professor Hayes, then at Thomas, processing information that adults took for granted. "Are you the papa from my dreams, the one who read stories?" "Yes, sweetheart," Professor Hayes whispered. "I read stories to you when you were a tiny baby. I've missed you every single day since we were separated." The conversation that followed was awkward, emotional, and complicated by the presence of a child who couldn't fully understand the adult complexities swirling around her. Professor Hayes explained how he'd survived the attack that killed Sarah's mother, how he'd searched desperately for his daughter's body, how he'd finally accepted that she died with Mary Catherine. Thomas shared the story of finding Sarah, of Belena nursing her back to health, of 3 years spent building a life together in Cedar Ridge. Both men spoke carefully, neither wanting to distress Sarah with the full emotional weight of their revelations. "Papa," Sarah interrupted during a pause in the conversation, "why are both of you sad? Are you mad at each other?" "No, sweetheart," Thomas assured her. "We're not mad. Sometimes adults feel very happy and very sad at the same time, especially when important things happen." As afternoon faded into evening, they agreed to continue their conversation after Sarah's surgery. The medical procedure took precedence over emotional revelations, and both men were united in their primary concern for her welfare. Dr. Brennan's assistant arrived to escort them to the surgical preparation area, where Sarah would spend the night. Under medical supervision, as Thomas tucked her into the hospital bed, Sarah looked between him and Professor Hayes with the kind of wisdom that sometimes emerged from children facing difficult circumstances. "Papa Thomas," she said clearly, "and Papa William. That's what I'm going to call you both because you both love me." The simple solution to their complex situation left both men speechless as Sarah drifted towards sleep, her small hand holding Maria while her future hung in the balance of surgical precision and adult decisions that would shape the rest of her life. The surgery lasted 4 hours, during which Thomas and Professor Hayes maintained their vigil in the hospital's waiting room, like two soldiers from opposing armies who discovered they were fighting for the same cause. They spoke little during those long hours, each lost in private prayers and fears that transcended their complicated relationship. When Dr. Brennan finally emerged, still wearing his surgical apron, both men stood simultaneously. "The surgery was successful," he announced, and Thomas felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. "I was able to clear the infection completely and repair the damaged structures. There's every reason to expect full recovery of hearing in that ear." Professor Hayes gripped the back of his chair, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Doctor. When can we see her?" "She's still unconscious from the chloroform, but you can sit with her during recovery. I should warn you, she'll be disoriented. When she wakes, and the ear will be bandaged for several days." They followed Dr. Brennan to a small recovery room where Sarah lay pale and still beneath crisp white sheets. Her right ear was wrapped in clean bandages, and her breathing was deep and regular. Maria sat propped on the bedside table, a faithful guardian watching over her sleeping companion. Thomas took the chair on one side of the bed, while Professor Hayes settled on the other, and for the first time since meeting, they had the opportunity to really study each other without Sarah's observant eyes monitoring their interaction. "Mr. McKenna, Thomas, I need you to know that I hold no resentment toward you," Professor Hayes said quietly. "What you did, taking in a dying child and raising her as your own, shows a kind of love that transcends social barriers." Thomas nodded, still not trusting his voice completely. "She saved me more than I saved her, Professor. Before Sarah, I was just a man accumulating wealth without purpose. She taught me what real success looks like. Please, call me William," Professor Hayes replied. "And I think we need to discuss Sarah's future honestly, without the child present to influence our conversation with her innocent wisdom." For the next hour, while Sarah slept peacefully between them, the two men shared their stories more completely. William spoke of his education, his work establishing schools for freed slaves, his dreams of providing his daughter with opportunities that had been denied to previous generations. Thomas described the ranch, Sarah's daily life, her relationships with Elena, and the community that had gradually accepted their unconventional family. "Thomas, I won't lie. When I first received your telegram, I assumed I would be taking Sarah back to Denver immediately. But seeing you with her, hearing how she speaks to you, watching the way she trusts you completely," William paused, choosing his words carefully. "I realize that I may be her biological father, but you are her papa in every way that daily love creates." The admission surprised Thomas with its generosity. "William, she deserves the educational advantages you can provide. The ranch is a good place for a child to grow up, but it's not a world of books and intellectual development. And Denver is not a world of horses and wide horizons where a child can run free, William countered. Perhaps the question isn't which of us should raise her alone, but how we can both contribute to her development. Their conversation was interrupted by a small sound from the bed. Sarah was stirring, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness returned. Both men leaned forward anxiously, watching for signs of pain or distress. Sarah's eyes opened slowly, unfocused from the lingering effects of anesthesia. She looked around the unfamiliar room with confusion before her gaze settled on the two, worried faces hovering over her. "Papa," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the surgical procedures. The word hung in the air between them, and both men realized she was looking at them both when she spoke. Thomas reached for one of her hands, while William gently touched her. "Shoulder! We're both here, sweetheart," Thomas said softly. "How do you feel?" Sarah considered the question with her characteristic seriousness, then surprised them with a weak smile. "My ear feels funny, but not hurty. Did the doctor fix it?" "Yes, darling," William answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Dr. Brennan says you're going to hear perfectly again." Over the next few days, as Sarah's strength returned and her natural cheerfulness reasserted itself, she demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of childhood by accepting her situation as a delightful complication rather than a problem to be solved. "I have two papas now," she explained to Maria during one of their whispered conversations that both men pretended not to overhear. "Papa Thomas teaches me about horses and being brave, and Papa William is going to teach me about books and big words. It's like having twice as much love." The adults' negotiations were more complex, but guided by Sarah's simple wisdom. William proposed that Sarah spend summers in Denver, receiving formal education and cultural experiences that would prepare her for whatever future she chose. Thomas would provide the stability of ranch life during the school year, along with the practical skills and outdoor experiences that built character and resilience. "She needs both worlds," William concluded during one of their evening discussions while Sarah slept peacefully in her hospital bed. "The intellectual stimulation I can provide and the emotional security you've created." Thomas found the arrangement more generous than he'd dared hope. "Are you certain this is what you want, William? You could take her back to Denver permanently. You have every legal and moral right." "Rights matter less than what serves Sarah best," William replied. "She's thrived under your care, and changing everything suddenly would be cruel to a child who's already endured enough disruption. Besides, I think we can learn from each other." On Sarah's final day in the hospital, as they prepared for the complex journey back to their respective homes, she made an observation that crystallized the wisdom they'd all discovered. "Papa Thomas, Papa William," she said, sitting up in bed. With Maria clutched in her arms, "I think God gave me two fathers because I needed twice as much love to grow up right." The simple theology of a 3-year-old resolved questions that adult minds had struggled to answer. Love wasn't diminished by being shared. It was multiplied. Family wasn't defined by blood alone. It was created by commitment, daily care, and the willingness to put a child's welfare above personal desires. As they prepared to leave Denver, with plans for Sarah to return in the summer and William to visit the ranch during spring roundup, Thomas realized that his greatest fear, losing Sarah, had been transformed into his greatest joy, gaining an extended family that would enrich her life beyond anything he could have provided alone. The little girl, who had called them both Papa, in her first clear word after surgery, had taught them that love creates its own grammar, and family writes its own rules. Spring arrived early at the McKenna ranch that year, bringing with it changes that went far beyond the seasonal transformation of landscape. Sarah's hearing had returned completely, her laughter once again filling the house with the kind of joy that made even the hardest winter days seem worthwhile. But more than her physical recovery, it was the expansion of their family that had fundamentally altered the rhythm of life in Cedar Ridge. The photograph sat prominently on Thomas's desk, a formal portrait taken during William's first visit to the ranch in March. The three of them stood together on the front porch, Thomas in his best suit, William in his professor's formal attire, and Sarah between them in the blue dress Elena had sewn specially for the occasion. What made the photograph remarkable wasn't its technical quality, but the genuine contentment visible on all three faces. "You look at that picture a dozen times a day," Elena observed, entering Thomas's office with the afternoon coffee that had become their daily ritual. "Anyone would think you'd never seen a photograph before." Thomas smiled, touching the frame gently. "I look at it because I want to remember how impossible it seemed 6 months ago. Now it feels like the most natural thing in the world." The arrangement they'd created defied every social convention Cedar Ridge had ever known, yet somehow it worked. William spent summers at the ranch, teaching Sarah advanced reading and mathematics while learning ranch operations that fascinated his academic mind. During the school year, he sent carefully selected books and writing assignments that challenged Sarah's growing intellect. Thomas provided daily love, practical skills, and the kind of security that came from unchanging routines and unconditional acceptance. The town's reaction had been mixed initially, but gradually the community had come to understand that love took many forms. Reverend Caldwell had spoken from the pulpit about biblical examples of unconventional families, reminding his congregation that Moses had been raised by Pharaoh's daughter and Samuel by the priest Eli. Dr. Harriman had become William's closest friend in town, their evening discussions of medicine and education drawing interested listeners who discovered that wisdom came in many colors. Even the men who'd confronted Thomas in the clinic had grudgingly accepted the new reality. Jake Morrison's feed store now carried the specialized books William ordered for Sarah's education, and his respect for the professor's intelligence had gradually overcome his initial prejudice. Frank Walsh had been forced to acknowledge that Sarah's presence had brought more cultured visitors to Cedar Ridge than the town had ever attracted, including prominent educators and writers who came to see the remarkable educational experiment taking place on a Colorado cattle ranch. Sarah herself had blossomed under the attention of two devoted fathers, each contributing unique gifts to her development. Her summers in Denver exposed her to museums, libraries, and cultural experiences that broadened her understanding of the world beyond the ranch. But it was her life in Cedar Ridge that provided the emotional anchor and practical skills that shaped her character. "Papa Thomas," she said one evening in late spring, looking up from the advanced reader William had sent for her 4th birthday, "when I grow up, I want to be like both of you." "How do you mean, sweetheart?" Thomas asked, settling beside her. On the porch swing that had become their favorite spot for evening conversations. "I want to teach children like Papa William does, but I also want to have a ranch where they can come learn about horses and being brave," she explained with the clarity that continued to amaze the adults in her life. "I think children need both kinds of learning." Thomas marveled at how naturally she'd synthesized the two worlds that had once seemed incompatible. At 4 years old, Sarah was already reading at a level that impressed William's university colleagues, yet she could also rope a fence post and calm a skittish horse with equal skill. More importantly, she moved between both worlds with confidence, equally comfortable in the professor's study and the ranch's stable. The success of their arrangement had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. William's letters mentioned inquiries from other educators interested in similar collaborations, and Thomas had received visits from ranchers curious about balancing traditional frontier life with formal education. Without intending to, they'd become pioneers in a different kind of territory, proving that family could transcend race, that love could overcome social prejudice, and that children thrived when surrounded by multiple sources of wisdom and care. Elena had been Sarah's greatest supporter throughout the transition, serving as translator between the worlds when language or cultural differences created confusion. Her gentle guidance had helped both fathers understand that their daughter could honor both heritages without choosing between them. "You have created something beautiful, Senor McKenna," Elena said, watching Sarah practice writing letters to her Denver friends while sitting in Thomas's office chair. "Not just a family, but a new way of thinking about what family can be." As summer approached and William prepared for his annual extended visit, Thomas reflected on how completely his life had changed since that night when Sarah's cry had sent him racing through darkness toward town. The wealthy rancher who had measured success in acres and cattle still existed, but he'd been transformed into something richer. A father whose legacy would be measured in a young woman's character rather than in landholdings. The photograph on his desk captured more than 3 people posing for posterity. It documented the moment when love had proven stronger than convention, when wisdom had overcome prejudice, and when a child's simple acceptance had taught adults how to redefine the boundaries of family. Sarah was no longer the abandoned infant he'd found in a burned cabin, nor was she simply the professor's lost daughter who'd been miraculously restored. She was something new, a bridge between worlds, proof that love could create its own traditions and write its own rules. As evening settled over the ranch and Sarah's laughter echoed from the stable where she was saying goodnight to her favorite horses, Thomas understood that the story begun that desperate night had no ending. It would continue through Sarah's achievements, through the children she might teach or raise, through the example their unconventional family provided for others facing similar choices. The photograph would fade with time. The specific details of their struggle would blur into memory, but the truth they'd discovered would endure, that love recognizes no boundaries, that family transcends blood, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in life emerge from the courage to embrace what seems impossible. Tomorrow would bring William's arrival for the summer, more adventures for Sarah to experience, and continued growth for all of them. But tonight, Thomas was content to sit on his porch, listen to his daughter's joyful voice, and marvel at how completely love had transformed everything he thought he knew about success, family, and the true meaning of home.